I will tell you what I saw because I was the one who saw it, and because I have spent 2 years looking for words that fit and have not found them in my own language. I am using Compact Standard now, which is not my first tongue, and that distance helps. When I speak Velorvath, the event becomes something my people already have categories for. Compact Standard has no category for what I watched at the Sol Vareth ring, and so the event stays open, the way a wound that has healed cleanly stays slightly tender at the scar line, not painful, simply present. I would rather it stayed open. The categories my court would give it are not accurate, and accuracy matters to me. My name is Thesavin Orvithsal. I am Empress of the Velorvath Third Compact, holder of the Amber Seat, sovereign of 7 reaches and 11 treaty corridors. I have held the seat for 41 years. I mention this not as ceremony, but because it is relevant to the account that follows. Because it means I was not young or inexperienced or easily impressed when the events of the 42nd month of the Orvithveth stabilization framework occurred, and I was still not prepared for them. What you have before you is my best attempt at an honest record, given in Compact Standard so that the Velorvath Register does not smooth the truth into something more comfortable. The treaty was Orvithveth Article 7. 2 years of sustained pressure from the Dovrak expansion corridor had brought my compact to the Union negotiating table, and the Union's senior compact liaison, a very composed woman named Arith Solon, had made clear that the stabilization framework they were offering, patrol corridor guarantees, supply route protection, electromagnetic interdiction on the 3 contested junction nodes, required a bilateral bond under Article 7's terms, a peace bond. A marriage in the Compact Standard translation, though in Velorvath the word is closer to anchor holding. You take an anchor, you hold it to the ground, and the anchor holds back the tide. The anchor the Union offered was a man. His name was Kalen Voss. His dossier arrived 2 weeks before the formal offer, and I reviewed it myself, which I do not always do for Article 7 candidates. He was 46 at the time of the filing. He had served in the Union's forward infantry for 22 years, had mustered out at 43 with a service record that was thorough and quietly distinguished, and had since worked as a route survey consultant for civilian freight corridor operations. Not a diplomat, not a politician, not a ceremonial presence. The compact liaison described him, in the covering note, as a careful man. I read his record, which was substantial in the way that long, undecorated service produces substantial records, full of decisions made correctly under pressure, with no particular audience for any of them. And I noted that he had declined the standard peace bond stipend, which candidates almost never do, and that when the compact liaison had asked his reasons for accepting the posting, his answer, logged in the treaty appendix as a matter of form, was 3 words: the stabilization holds. That seemed sufficient. I accepted the offer. He arrived on a Union Transit shuttle 17 days later with 2 travel bags, and a compact reader, and no retinue. My chamberlain, Sale Orvithven, received him at the landing platform at the Sol Vareth capital, and noted in his intake summary, Sale always wrote intake summaries, that the human had looked out across the Sol grasslands for a long time before coming inside. Not nervously, attentively, as though he were learning the view. I was in session when he arrived and did not meet him until the 3rd day. I received him in the East Wing audience chamber, at the end of the morning's administrative proceedings, while my chamberlain was closing the tributary records for the season. The audience chamber is long and amber-lit, the light coming from the high clerestory windows that run along the eastern wall. It was a clear morning and the light was direct, and I noted as he crossed the floor that he moved differently than Velorvath men of equivalent build, not smaller or diminished but compressed, the way a mechanism is compressed when every unnecessary component has been removed. He stopped at the correct distance, close enough to address formally, far enough for courtesy, and inclined his head. Not a bow. In Velorvath protocol, a bow signals subjection. An inclination signals peer address. He had read something, or someone had briefed him well. Either possibility was acceptable. I told him the terms of the posting in Velorvath, which he did not yet speak, while the compact reader on his belt ran translation. He listened without shifting his weight or looking away, which is not as common as you might expect. When I finished, he said, in compact standard, "I understand the terms." Then he said, "Is there anything useful I can do here while the framework holds?" My Chamberlain Sale made a sound from behind his records that was not quite a laugh. The court attendants who had remained for the closing of session did not make any sound at all. I told him in compact standard this time that his presence was the function. He nodded as though that were the expected answer and said, "Understood." Then he asked if there was a library. The archives were open to him the following morning. His first week in the Orvithsal archives produced a request list that my head archivist, Thes Orvi Thrale, brought to Sale in some bewilderment, and which Sale brought to me. The human was not reading the curated diplomatic briefings. He was reading primary records, the original Velorvath treaty frameworks, the full corridor agreements going back to the founding compact, the 3 prior failed stabilizations in their original language, and the Dovrak border incident records going back 6 centuries. He had requested the original language version specifically, and was running them through his compact reader one document at a time. Sale waited for my direction. I said, "Let him read what he wants." Sale wrote this down, which meant he found it notable. The court's assessment of Kalen Voss settled within the first season. The Velorvath court is good at assessments, in the sense that it produces them quickly and consistently. He was small by Velorvath standards compact, and he had none of the visible conditioning that marks a warrior of rank in our culture. No crest marks, no ceremonial blade, no decorations worn. He attended the formal sessions I invited him to and stood where the protocol placed him, which was to the left rear of the amber seat, and he watched everything with the same unhurried attention he gave the archive documents. He did not speak unless addressed. He did not press for precedence or access. He accepted the meals and the quarters and the working arrangements without comment or adjustment. The court saw nothing threatening in him and decided he was decorative, which in Velorvath means present but not consequential, a symbol, which was, of course, what the treaty required. I did not entirely share the court's assessment, but I did not contradict it. He was the treaty anchor. He did not need to be anything else. What I did not know, what I would not fully understand until the morning at Salvarath, was that he was watching the court as carefully as the court was not watching him. He told me this himself. Some months later, in the fragmentary way he told most personal things, in the course of discussing something else, as though the information were a detail that happened to be relevant. He had been learning Velorvath from the archive records, and from a compact standard language resource his reader had indexed, and by the 24th month he could follow most of a court session without the translation running, which meant that no one was filtering what he heard. He had been learning the room the way he learned everything, slowly, from primary documents, with no audience for the process. He had also been learning the corridor. 7 months into the posting, he had found an anomaly in the western drainage surveys of the 7th reach, an elevation error of 40 meters in the 3rd sub-corridor that made 2 patrol routes non-viable in the seasonal flood period. The error was in the foundational survey, which predated the current compact by over 6 centuries. He had been tracking it, building a correction model, waiting to understand whether it was his place to bring it forward. That was how he phrased it when he finally did bring it forward, 3 years in. I wasn't sure if it was my place. But I am ahead of myself. In the 14th month, there was a state occasion, a formal reception for the tributary lords of the 2nd Reach, a 3-day event with the ceremonial weight my court brings to such things. Kalen Voss attended in his capacity as bond companion, dressed in the compact attire he always wore, and stood in the correct position, and ate what was served. The tributary lords were curious about him, in the way the Velorvath aristocracy is curious about things it has assessed as unthreatening. Idly, with the confidence of people who have already decided the answer and are only mildly interested in confirmation. Several of them addressed him in the elaborate formal register, which is difficult even for native speakers. He answered in plain Velorvath, correctly formed, which surprised them into silence, and then in compact standard, adding context. They had not asked for about the Western Corridor patrol routes that he delivered with the courtesy of a man who assumes everyone shares his interest in logistics data. After the occasion, my second counselor Orvith Sonrail told me privately that the human was odd. I said, yes. He said, in a way that is difficult to name. I said, yes. He looked at me to see if this was a problem, and I told him it was not. By the end of the first year, he had begun to speak Velorvath. Haltingly at first, the phonology is difficult for human speakers, the resonant stops in particular, but with improving accuracy as the months went on. He had learned it entirely from documents and from the language resource on his reader with no tutor, because he had not asked for one and I had not thought to offer one. When Sale found out he was learning without instruction, he offered to arrange lessons with the court linguist, and Kalen Voss said thank you, and if the linguist is available, and then did not follow up on the arrangement, which Sale interpreted as reluctance, and I interpreted as the behavior of a man who preferred primary sources. He was not reluctant. He simply learned differently than most. By the 22nd month, he could follow a court session without translation, which meant that the court was, without realizing it, having its discussions heard by someone who understood every word. The court was not cautious about what it said in the vicinity of the bond companion, because the bond companion had been assessed as decorative, and decorative things are not a consideration. He heard, over the course of those months, the court's full and unfiltered opinion of every matter before the amber seat, including several matters that pertained to him. He did not alter his behavior in response to any of it. Sale, who had come to watch him as attentively as he watched everything else, told me later that this was not indifference. It was the behavior of a man who had already decided what his function was, and found the court's editorial commentary irrelevant to it. In the 28th month, I invited him to attend a session of the 7th Reach Administrative Review, which I was chairing. It was not his area. His formal role under the Article 7 framework was presence, not governance, but I had been reading his archive requests, and I thought his view on the 7th Reach drainage records might be relevant. He came to the session. He sat in the observer's position, to the rear of the chamber, and listened. When the Reach administrators reached the 3rd Sub-Corridor Patrol alignment, he did not speak. But afterward in the corridor, he stopped and waited until my chamberlain had moved ahead and said to me, quietly, "The elevation data in the sub-corridor section is wrong. The survey it's based on has an error that puts both patrol routes in the wrong drainage basin." I looked at him. He said, "I've been building a correction model." I wasn't sure if it was my place to bring it up in session. "I can show you the data if you want." I said, "Show me now." He showed me in the corridor, standing with his compact reader at an angle so I could see the screen, going through the discrepancy point by point with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything. He had 7 months of tracking notes. The elevation error was exactly where he said it was. The correction was clearly indicated. I said, "File this with the survey office as a priority amendment." He said, "It will need your authorization." I said, "I'll authorize it now." He looked at me briefly with the gray, direct gaze, and then he looked at the compact reader and filed the amendment, and the 7th Reach Patrol routes were corrected before the next seasonal assessment. I thought about that day sometimes in the months that followed, not because of the drainage anomaly, which was important but not exceptional, because of the moment in the corridor, the quiet wait while my chamberlain moved ahead, the precise calibration of when to speak, the 7 months of documented work offered with one sentence. I wasn't sure if it was my place. He had been certain enough of his own analysis to maintain it for 7 months. He had been uncertain enough of his standing to hold it until he had an unambiguous moment to offer it. Both things were true at once. The Dovrak challenge arrived in the 40th month of the stabilization. Lord Saylorvith Dehan of the Dovrak Expansion Authority sent a formal Orvithvan claim to the Velorvath Compact. The Orvithvan is an ancient law, predating the Compact by 3 centuries, written into the foundational charter at the insistence of the warrior clan councils when the diplomatic framework was established. It holds that if a treaty is bound by a peace anchor who cannot demonstrate worth before the Solvarath ring, the challenging party may demand the duel, and the treaty dissolves or holds depending on the outcome. The law is old. It has provisions for who may stand for the anchor. The third supplement from the Amber Court, which was sealed for 412 years, contains an expansion clause that Lord Dehan had apparently not read. I had not read it either at that point, but someone in my compact had read it, because the amendment request I had filed from the corridor had gone through the Survey Office database, and the Survey Office database cross-references relevant treaty law when filing priority corrections, and the relevant treaty law for corridor amendments includes the Orvithvan supplement, because the supplement's expansion clause covers treaty corridor governance rights. Kalen Voss had been in the Survey Office 3 days before the challenge arrived to check on the status of the correction filing. He was there when the cross-reference notation appeared in the system. He read the supplement in the Survey Office and returned to his quarters and read it again. I know all of this because he told me later. The challenge scroll arrived on a clear morning in the 41st month. My High Counselor, Reith Orvith-San, came to my private study with it and laid it before me with the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news they have had time to prepare for. He said, "The treaty anchor cannot meet this." He meant it with kindness. He had 3 counterfiling alternatives prepared, because Reith always prepared alternatives. He laid them before me in order of technical complexity and stood back to let me read. I was reading the first alternative when I heard footsteps in the corridor, and Kalen Voss appeared in the doorway. He had been in the adjacent document room, reviewing the corridor patrol schedules with my logistics officer, which was a routine task he had taken on 3 seasons earlier because the logistics officer's compact standard was imprecise, and the scheduling documents needed cross-checking against the compact registry. He had heard the courier pass. He had waited for the logistics officer to finish a sentence and then excused himself and come directly. He stood in the doorway and looked at the scroll on my work table and said, in compact standard, without particular emphasis, "I'll go to the ring." Reith turned to look at him, as though he had spoken in an unfamiliar language. I said, "You understand what the ring is?" He said, "Yes. The Orvithvan single combat first yield conducted at the Solvarath Standing Circle on the Western Treaty Plain. I've read the protocols. The third supplement from the Amber Court, which is publicly accessible in the Compact Treaty database, contains an expansion clause that extends the right to stand for the treaty anchor to the anchor's bond companion, provided the bond companion can demonstrate a treaty governance record. I filed a priority survey correction in the 28th month under your authorization. That's a treaty governance action. I qualify under the expansion clause." There was a silence in my study. He said, "Lord Dehan has held the Orvithvan ring twice. His combat record is in the Dovrak Military Registry, which is publicly available under Compact Information Access Provisions. I've read it. He fights the Velorvath traditional form, the angular approach, the long blade line. It's designed for Velorvath opponents of his size and training. I'm not a Velorvath opponent." Reith said quietly, "Lord Dehan is a senior blade rank commander. He has not been defeated in the ring." Kalen Voss said, "No, against Velorvath form fighters who engaged on his terms. I don't engage on his terms." He said it without bravado, not the voice of a man trying to convince anyone of his own worth. It was the voice of a man who had done a calculation and was presenting the result, including the uncertainty. He said it the way he said most things, as a plain statement of fact, offered for consideration, complete with the parts that were not guaranteed. I looked at him for a long time. He held the look with the gray steadiness he always had, not asserting anything, not apologizing, not performing. His eyes were direct in the way that does not ask permission. I said, "The ring is tomorrow if I accept." He said, "I know." I said, "If the duel is lost, the treaty dissolves. The Dovrak Expansion Authority challenges all 3 junction nodes within 60 days. He said, "Yes, I don't think I'll lose, but you should know the calculation." That sentence, I have returned to it many times. He gave me the risk plainly, the full calculation, including what it contained if he was wrong, because he believed I was owed accurate information, not the performance of confidence, the actual accounting. I accepted the challenge. The journey to the Solvareth ring is 3 days across the Western Treaty Plain, following the transit road that runs between the relay stations through the long grass. It was early in the season for that corridor, the grass still the pale gold of the dry period, and the sky very wide and very clear, the relay stations marking the distance at intervals of perhaps 1,000 strides each, their overhead panels lit against the daylight like small answers to the sun. My party traveled with the appropriate escort, wreath and sail, and my senior observers, 4 treaty guards, the ring arbitrators from the Amber Court, and Kalen Voss traveled in the middle of the convoy with his bags and his compact reader, reading as he always read, the way another person might breathe, as a continuous background condition of being alive. On the second morning, Wreath came to ride beside me and said, carefully in Velorvath, not loudly, "He reads as though nothing is unusual." I said, "Yes." Wreath said, "Is he afraid?" I considered the question seriously, because it deserved consideration. In 41 years holding the Amber seat, I had sent people into difficult situations, and I had learned to read the way fear lives in bodies, the small adjustments, the careful management of the face, the way people speak more precisely than usual when they are keeping something locked down. Kalen Voss was reading a schematic. His posture was the same as it was in the document room. His face was the face of a man who is working. I said, "I don't think fear is how he processes risk." Wreath said, "What does he do with it?" I said, "I think he calculates it. I thought about what he had said in my study. I don't think I'll lose, but you should know the calculation," and I said, "He told me the duel was a logistics problem. I believe him." Wreath was quiet for a while, watching the relay stations pass. He said, finally, "The duel is also Lord Dehaan's long blade against a compact service knife. That is not typically a logistics problem." I said, "No," I said, "I know." We rode in silence for a while, and the relay stations marked our passage. And behind us in the convoy I heard, in the quiet between the wind and the grass, the soft tap of a compact reader as Kalen Voss turned a page. We arrived at the Solvareth fortification settlement at late afternoon on the 3rd day. The standing stone ring was visible from the approach road, the stones dark against the golden grass, taller than 2 Velorvath in height, and ancient in the way that things become when they have been significant for long enough that the significance has worn into the material itself. Lord Dehaan and his party were already encamped at the eastern approach. I saw him at the far edge of the perimeter, tall and armored and deliberate, walking the stone boundary as a senior dual holder does, taking ownership of the space with his footsteps, claiming the geometry. He saw us arrive. He saw the convoy. He saw Kalen Voss, who was wearing dark compact work clothes and a service badge and carrying nothing visible, and from that distance I watched Lord Dehaan pause and look, and the pause lasted slightly longer than it should have. We made camp at the western approach. That evening at the fire, Kalen Voss ate what was prepared and then took out his compact reader and read, as he always did when there was time, and I found myself watching him across the fire. The light was orange on his face. He was reading the Orvith Van supplements again. I could see the schematic view on his screen, and his expression was the expression of a man who is working. Not anxious. Working. Sale came to sit beside me and said, quietly in Velorvath, "What do you think he is?" I said honestly, "I don't know." Sale said, "No, he studied the fire for a moment," he said. "I have been watching him for 40 months. I still don't know." Lord Dehan sent a courtesy message at the 3rd hour of the night, which the protocol required. It was polite in the formal register, and underneath, the formal register carried the shape of a man who expects the morning to be brief. I read it and gave it to Reith to archive and sat for a while in the tent door looking out at the standing stones in the moonlight. The 3 moons of the Orvithsal system, all risen at slightly different heights, the grass moving in a wind from the relay corridor. The morning came cold. The 3 moons were still visible at the western horizon, pale now in the early light, and the standing stones were sharp against a sky that had turned from black to the dark blue that precedes the color. I stood at the eastern mark with Reith and Sale and my observer representatives. Lord Dehan stood at the western mark with his retinue, armored in the full Dovrak blade-rank configuration, articulated dark panels, the signature long blade at his hip, crest mark visible at the throat seal. He moved with the ease of a man who has been in many rings and expected to leave all of them standing, and between him and my group, in the center of the stone circle, the 2 duelists were taking their marks. Kalen Voss wore no armor. He had a compact service blade, the kind Union infantry carry as secondary equipment, a working tool, not a weapon of ceremony, shorter than the Velorvath standard, with a plain grip worn smooth at the palm. He held it at his left side, edge down, the way a man holds a thing he intends to use as precisely as possible rather than as impressively as possible. Lord Dehan looked across the ring at him, and I watched Dehan recalibrate. The human was smaller, lighter, unarmored, and entirely without ceremony, and Lord Dehan was experienced enough to know that this was either foolishness or something he had not properly prepared for. For one moment at the marks, I saw him making that decision. The ring arbitrators called the forms, both duelists acknowledged, the signal was given. I have tried many times to describe what happened in that ring, and I will try again here with the understanding that the description will be incomplete. Lord Dehan fought the way a senior blade rank commander fights, with authority, with pattern recognition from many previous engagements, with a line that has been effective in every Velorvath ring he has entered. He came in on the angular approach, the traditional form, the geometry that closes distance while controlling blade angle, and he expected the human to respond as a Velorvath fighter would respond, moving into the engagement line, establishing the press, the counter-pivot, the orthodox sequence. Kalen Voss stepped out of the line. Not back, not away. Into the space beside the line, which in Velorvath form is a disadvantaged position. In whatever form he was using, it was not. He moved with the compressed precision of a man who has thought about distance and weight and timing for a very long time and has no excess motion remaining in any of it. One movement, completely committed, beginning and ending in the same decision. The entire geometry of Lord Dehan's approach became irrelevant. Lord Dehan's blade met empty air. From both retinues, on both sides of the ring, there was a sound that I can only describe as collective recalibration. The sound of people who have been watching for one kind of event and have found a different kind in its place. Lord Dehan recovered and reset. He is a skilled fighter. He is skilled enough to adjust mid-engagement, which is not a small thing. He revised his approach, came again on a different line, with more caution, and a wider arc intended to compensate for the lateral movement. Kalen Voss read it. This is what I mean when I say the description is inadequate. What I watched in that ring did not look like the dual records I have seen in the Velorvath archives. It did not look like the Orvith Van documents describe. It was quiet. It was almost still to the eye. Each time Lord Dehan committed to a line, the human was not there, and the not being there was precise and deliberate and slightly earlier than what Dehan had anticipated each time, by a margin too small to name but too consistent to be chance. The service blade was used sparingly. The movement was used sparingly. There was nothing wasted. I counted 11 exchanges. On the 11th, Lord Dehan overcommitted. It was a fraction, the fraction that accumulates over 10 engagements that have not produced their expected result, when a skilled fighter begins to compensate for patterns that are not there. He pushed his arc wider on the 11th approach to account for the lateral movement the human had used twice, and the human did not go lateral. He stepped short, inside the arc, into the inside line that was theoretically the most disadvantaged position in the engagement, and placed the service blade at Lord Dehan's wrist at the gap in the articulated armor, with sufficient pressure to score the skin and no more. First yield. The ring arbitrators called it. The silence that followed was the longest silence I have witnessed in 41 years of holding the amber seat. Reith told me afterward it lasted 40 seconds. Sale thought less 25, perhaps 30. I cannot give you a number. What I know is that within that silence I looked at Kalen Voss standing in the center of the standing stone ring with the service blade held at his side again, edge down, and I looked at Lord Dehan holding his wrist, and I looked at the Velorvath and Dovrak observers on both sides of the ring, all of them very still, and I had no word for what I was witnessing. Lord Dehan looked at his wrist. Then he looked at the human beside him, and in his face was the expression of a man who has been handed a result that his record does not contain. Not defeat, he has been defeated before, in training and in early career, in the ordinary course of a long service. Something else. Something closer to the expression a careful mind makes when it is constructing a new category from insufficient material, and the material is very strange. Kalen Voss looked at Lord Dehan for a moment. Then he lowered the blade the rest of the way to his side and stepped back to his mark and waited, because the yield had been called but the formal completion still required the arbitrator's spoken acknowledgement, and he knew the protocol because he had read the protocol, and he observed it with the same precision he brought to everything. The arbitrators spoke the forms. The ring was closed. Velorvath has good words. My language is old and precise, and has developed specific terminology for many things that other languages render in approximations. It has excellent words for battle glory, for warrior excellence, for the earned pride of the proven fighter, for tactical genius, for the courage of the shield line in a fixed engagement. All of these words carry within them the assumption of performance, of greatness, as something witnessed and recognized and placed in the existing record. They require an audience and a frame, and a category prepared before the event. What I had watched had no frame. It had not been performed. It had been done, the way Kalen Voss did everything, without ornament, without the record in mind, without the structure of other people's recognition as a component of the act. He had done the calculation, found the correct result, and produced it. As though the audience were a detail and the ring were a logistics problem, and the work were its own sufficient justification. Compact standard came closer, but not close enough. I thought about quiet competence and lethal economy and deliberate precision, and none of them held the full weight of the thing. They described the surface. They did not describe what it required to be the kind of person who produces that surface, in that ring, without performing it. Lord Dehan and his party withdrew before the mid-morning. There was no ceremony in the withdrawal and no prolonged departure. They packed their camp and took the Eastern Transit Road, and the last I saw of Lord Dehan was his armor catching the early light at the crest of the first rise, moving away at the pace of a man who has already begun calculating what comes next. He is, above all, practical. I have always understood that about him, even at a distance. In different circumstances, I might have respected it more. We stayed another day at Solvarath for the formal documentation. Wreaths, secondary filings, the arbitrator's recorded log of the yield and the ring closure, the formal treaty status transmission to the compact registry. The fortification settlement's administrative building has a long work table in the central room and adequate light from the western windows, and I sat there through the afternoon signing documents as they came to me. And Kalen Voss sat at the far end of the same table and read, which he did every afternoon when there was time, and I was aware of him in the way I had not quite been aware of him before the ring. Not differently, exactly, but more accurately. As though the resolution on something that had always been present had improved. I found the word by evening. I found it by evening. It is from the old Velorvath form, the register we use for things that have no contemporary equivalent. Orvi Sol Veth. It does not translate cleanly. The closest I have been able to render it in compact standard is the one who stood in the place that could not be named before he stood in it. The place I did not know existed. The place that was empty before he occupied it and that I recognize now, looking back, as having always been present, a shape the room already contained, waiting for someone of the correct dimensions. That evening I went to where he was. He was at the western boundary wall of the fortification settlement, where the standing stone ring was visible as a dark outline at the edge of the plain in the last light. He was standing at the wall looking out, in the way he had looked out across the Sol grasslands on the first day he arrived, not performing contemplation, but actually observing, learning the view. The 3 moons of our system were rising, all 3 at slightly different heights and slightly different colors at that time of the evening. Amber, pale, and one that is almost green in the right conditions. I walked to where he was and stood beside him without speaking. He had heard me approach and did not turn, which by now I understood was his way. He waited for what you wanted to say, and he did not perform the mechanics of social acknowledgement as a substitute for the actual exchange. I found it, as I had found most things about him, clarifying. I said his name first, then I said in Velorvath, Orvi Solveth. He turned then, because he had been studying Velorvath for over a year from archive records and a language resource on his reader, and he had reached the point where he could tell that I was not using court language. He looked at me with the direct gray attention and waited. I said, it's old Velorvath. I don't have a compact standard translation that holds the full weight of it. The closest is the one who stood in the place I didn't know how to name, the place that was empty until you filled it. He was quiet for a moment. He said, I didn't go to the ring for the treaty. I said, I know. I said it, and I understood as I said it that I had known this since the morning, since the moment he stood at the marks with the service blade held at his side, and looked across the ring toward me without performing anything. He said, you knew before the ring. I said, no, I understood it after, there's a difference. He looked at the moons for a moment. He said, the treaty holds. I said, yes. The treaty holds, and the 3rd junction node has been cleared of the Dovrak counterfiling, and Wreath is completing the secondary documentation now. The stabilization framework is intact. He said, good. I said, I want to tell you what the word means fully, because I have been careless with what I gave you these 40 months, and I would like to correct the record. He looked at me. I said, I told you that your presence was the function. That was true in the terms of the treaty. It was not true in the terms of what you actually brought to this compact, and I knew that, and I let the court's assessment stand because it was convenient and because I did not want to disrupt the balance of the framework. I was wrong to do that. He said nothing for a moment. He was listening. I said, you corrected the 7th Reach Drainage Survey in month 28. You have been cross-referencing the patrol route filings with the compact registry for 3 seasons. You have been sitting in the document room while my logistics officer works because his compact standard is imprecise, and the scheduling records need someone who reads both languages and knows that precision matters. You read the Orvithvan supplement and found the expansion clause and came to my study and told me you would go to the ring before I had finished reading the first counterfiling. I do not know how to account for all of that in the terms I was given, but I know it does not fit into decorative, and I know Orvith Solveth is closer to the truth than anything else I have. He was quiet for a while. The almost green moon cleared the horizon fully, which happens only twice a year on the western plain, and the grass went from gold to silver in the combined light of all three, and the standing stones at the ring were dark shapes against it. He said, I thought about leaving once. I said, I know, you told me this. He said, month 14, after the tributary reception. The lords addressed me in the formal register, and I answered, and several of them found it amusing that I could speak Velorvath. And after the reception, your second counselor told you I was odd in a way that was difficult to name, and you agreed with him. Sale mentioned it to the logistics officer, and the logistics officer mentioned it to me, because the logistics officer is very poor at boundaries and very well-meaning about it. I said, I remember the occasion. He said, I wasn't offended. I understood the assessment. What I thought about was whether I was doing anything of use here or whether I was only present. I stayed because of the drainage anomaly. I thought, I will finish the correction model and then decide. By the time the model was finished, I had also been here 2 years, and the treaty was holding, and I had found 3 other filing errors in the corridor records that hadn't been corrected since the founding compact, and it seemed clear that there was more work to do and no particular reason to leave it undone. I said, and the ring this morning. He said, the ring was a logistics problem. Lord Dehan issued the Orvithvan in the expectation of a specific type of opponent. The expansion clause changed the terms of the opponent. His preparation was calibrated for Velorvath form. I am not a Velorvath form fighter. The discrepancy between his preparation and the actual engagement geometry was predictable from his record and from the Orvithvan protocols which I had read. I made the calculation. The calculation held. He paused. Then he said, I knew before I went to your study that the calculation held. I didn't go to the ring because the calculation was certain. I went because someone needed to go, and the calculation was better than nothing. I said, you fought like nothing I have seen in 41 years on the amber seat. He was quiet for a moment. He said, the Velorvath form is very effective against Velorvath form opponents. It's a system developed over centuries for a specific context. I'm not in that context, and Lord Dehan had prepared for someone who was. The inside line he left open was not an error in his training. It was an assumption built into the form, that no opponent with a shorter weapon would choose it, because against a Velorvath fighter it is genuinely disadvantaged. He was right about the form. He was wrong about me. I said, I understand the technical explanation. That is not what I am trying to say. He said, I know. He looked at the 3 moons. He said, what are you trying to say? I said, I am trying to say that I watched you in that ring and I saw something I don't have a category for, and I went looking for a word, and the only word I found that comes close to accurate is one from the oldest register of my language, and I want to give it to you precisely because precision matters to both of us, and I have been imprecise about you for 40 months. He looked at me then. Not the familiar gray waiting attention, something slightly different, something that was also listening but more carefully, the way a person listens when they have not expected to be addressed directly. I held the look. I said, what I am trying to say is that you are owed something more accurate than what I have been giving you. He was very still for a moment. The way he was sometimes still, not uncertain, but waiting, the way he waited when something was being confirmed that he had not quite allowed himself to expect. Then he said, what does Orvith Solveth mean exactly? I heard the syllables. I know the root of Solveth. I said, Solveth is the Velorvath word for the specific shape of an absence, not an empty space generally, but the negative impression of something that should be present. The contour that remains when something that belongs in a room is not there. He said, an Orvith. I said, Orvith is the root for what fills the contour, the precise fit, not an approximation or a replacement, the thing that was always the correct shape for the space. He took this in, he said after a moment, and Sol in the middle. I said the possessive, my. He was quiet again. Then he said, in Velorvath, careful with the form, the accent of a man who has taught himself from documents and knows it, Orvith Solveth, my correct shape for the empty space. I said yes, approximately. He said, the form is mine to use in response. I said yes, if you choose to. He looked at the standing stones for a moment. Then he said quietly in Velorvath, Orvith Solveth. Just that back to me and to no one else. I had not expected it. I found I had no answer in any language, and that this was correct, that the exchange required no answer, that some things are completed by being spoken and require nothing further. We stood at the boundary wall while the 3 moons rose further and the grass moved in the relay corridor wind, and the duel was done, and the treaty was whole, and the word had been spoken and returned, and I was aware that the day I had lived was one I would carry for the rest of my sovereignty. We returned to the capital 4 days later. Kalen Voss filed the proposed patrol route correction for the 7th Reach subcorridor 2 days after that, with a full documented amendment and my authorization noted in the header, and the survey office processed it by the end of the week. It was the first time a peace bond companion had originated a priority treaty governance filing in the compact's recorded history. The survey office noted this in the processing record, in the dry language survey offices use for matters of procedure. The notation reads, filed under bilateral bond companion governance rights per Treaty Article 7, expansion clause confirmed. He has since filed 4 additional corrections. My court, cautiously and without announcing it, has begun to bring questions to him directly. Not through me, directly, which is the Velorvath way of acknowledging that a person is consequential. Reith brings him corridor queries. The head archivist, Thes Orvithrail, who was bewildered by his reading requests in the first month, now leaves documents on his work table unprompted when she finds material she thinks might interest him. My second counselor, Orvith Sonrail, who told me the human was odd in a way that was difficult to name, has twice asked him for his reading of a compact legal provision, and twice received an answer that resolved a problem the counselors had been working around for a season. He does not seem to find any of this remarkable. He treats it as he treats everything, as work to do with the available tools for the available purpose. The logistics officer has improved his compact standard considerably, under the sustained influence of someone who cares about precision and is patient about it. Lord Dehan has not issued a second challenge. His military record in the Dovrak registry now carries an Orvith Van notation in the field reserved for ring outcomes. I have read it. It says, First Yield, 11th Exchange, Western Solvarath Ring. There is a field for additional notes. It is blank. The Dovrak military registry apparently did not have a standard notation for the type of opponent he encountered at Solvarath, and no one has yet written one in. That is, I think, accurate. The gap in the record is the most honest thing about it. 2 years have passed since the ring. The treaty holds. The corridor is stable. The drainage anomaly has been corrected, and the error has been removed from the foundational survey, which means 6 centuries of imprecise patrol routes have been made accurate at last. The survey office found 2 additional elevation errors in the adjoining subcorridors during the correction process. Those have since been corrected as well. Kalen Voss is working on a comprehensive review of the foundational survey documents, which he began on his own initiative in the 43rd month, and which no one had thought to commission in the 600 years the survey records had been in use. The review is, I am told by the head archivist, methodical and exact, It will take another 2 years. He has already found 7 discrepancies. He works in the document room adjacent to the audience chamber, which I had the interior wall adjusted to add a second window in the 44th month, so that the room has direct afternoon light. He did not request this. He would not have requested it. I authorized it because precision requires adequate light, and adequate light is something I can provide, and it is a small and accurate thing to do for a man who has been doing small and accurate things for this compact for 3 years. In the evenings, when the work is done and the amber light is low in the clear-story windows, he sometimes stands at the new window and looks out at the Saul grasslands the way he looked at them on the first day he arrived, attending to them, learning the view, making sure he knows the room. And I find that I watch him from across the corridor sometimes, in the quiet moment before the evening session begins, and I think about the word I gave him at the boundary wall, and about what he gave me in return. I have not found a better word than Orvith Solveth. I have looked, and the search has been thorough, and the old Velorvath register remains the most accurate instrument I have. The one who stood in the place that could not be named before he stood in it. The correct shape for the space. My correct shape for the space. He stood in it because the treaty needed someone to stand there, and he was the one who could, and that was sufficient reason, and he did not require any other frame for it. That is the thing I did not understand for 40 months and understand now. He does not perform for the record. He does the work, and the work is its own answer, and if the record comes to find him, as it did at the Solvarath ring, he is already there. I was the record. I was the one who finally came to find him. I am glad I did not wait longer, and I intend not to wait again.